Thank you very much, everyone, and thanks for spending the time here. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the idea of Paul in the 2nd century. That's what I told Don I would talk about, but I'm going to concentrate mostly on Paul in relationship to his own letter collection. And I think you'll see how that is something of interest to me and perhaps something of interest to you as well as we go. So let me start with just a couple of introductory words. And first of all, that is, as you know now, probably from Don and from some of your other speakers, the 2nd century is a period of, in some ways, relative lack of knowledge. And in New Testament studies, it's sometimes been called a tunnel period. I think Howard Marshall uses that term because it's like a tunnel. You know, you're going through it, but you can't really see what is around you. We know less, primarily because we have fewer documents to deal with. And that makes the records that we have even more valuable. And that's been a part of the problem. What do we make of the documents that we have in the 2nd century? And so what I'm going to try to do is show you how some of these 2nd century documents can actually be fairly instructive. So a little background to the discussion. This is Paul in the 2nd century. Actually, over the history of scholarship, Paul has grown in importance in the 2nd century, as scholarship has tended to place many of his letters in the 2nd century. And so that is something I'm going to be talking about. Many of you will be familiar with the German scholar F.C. Bauer, lived in the early to mid 19th century. And he was connected with the rise of historical criticism, especially a naturalistic and rationalistic approach to Christianity. He was rethinking questions of canon. What are the books that are in the New Testament? Why are they there? And along with that, questions of dating and authorship of these books. And of course, with that, you have the rise of a lot of discussion of the topic of pseudepigraphal authorship. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Many of you will know that Bauer thought that there were 4 authentic Pauline letters: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, with the others written later, even into the early to mid 2nd century. So Bauer, we know, was influenced by Hegel, the philosopher. So he had this kind of dialectic approach to things. He liked to see an opposition between Jewish Christianity and Hellenistic or Pauline Christianity. And that was a sort of a fundamental opposition he saw in the early church. And he identified the major authentic letters on the basis of their discussion of justification by faith, arguably a conclusion that he came to under the influence of his own Lutheran upbringing and the influence of Lutheranism on him. But he said then there was an influence of Gnosticism. And you see this in other works like Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians, like the Colossians hymn. And that made him want to put them later than Paul himself, under the influence of Gnosticism into the 2nd century, possibly with something like the pastorals as sort of a third group of letters. And they're often now referred to, the pastorals, as reflecting early Catholicism. What's that? That means it's sort of early institutionalization of the church, such as came to be equated with the Roman Catholic Church. You have hierarchy, you have ritual, you have liturgy, you have positions like elders, deacons, things like that. So you can see what happens here is that under the influence of Bauer, and then people followed after him, there was a spreading out of the Pauline letters. You think, well, Paul wrote his letters during Paul's lifetime, which is a legitimate thing to think. But now, under the influence of the thinking of Bauer and others, it's spread out, right, into the 2nd century. And so the pastoral epistles are placed by some people then in the middle of the 2nd century. And for Bauer, he also took the book of Acts and put it in the 2nd century, rather than Acts being an account of the forming of the church and its early development. Acts was a work that reflected the coming together and the sort of the synthesis, if you think of a Hegelian dialectic between Jewish Christianity and Hellenistic Christianity. It reflected a synthesis between the two, and the author's writing later to make it look like the church was more harmonious than it was, because it was faced with opposition. Bauer also dated the book of John's Gospel to the middle or so of the 2nd century. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily hold to Bauer's conclusions anymore, but Bauer's conclusions have been surprisingly influential upon scholarship, been very resilient in a lot of ways. And so a lot of scholars today would tend to put books into the 2nd century, and hence with Paul's letters, you've got to say they are pseudepigraphal then in authorship. So in that sense, the 2nd century becomes, in some people's eyes, a kind of a part of the apostolic period, in the sense that it's a part of the formation of then what comes to be the Bible. What makes it more complex is that there are other works, other books that we know of that were written during this same period that don't make it into the New Testament, right? And so the temptation is to think that we have a lot of competing books going on. So like 1 Clement, that letter that was written probably around 96 AD, it's not in the New Testament, but then it would be arguably written earlier than some books in the New Testament. The Didache, lots of different dates on when the Didache was written. Some place it incredibly early. Some people put it into later, into the 2nd century. It's all over the place. But there are other non-canonical works. We know of the Apostolic Fathers. We have other gospel accounts, some fragmentary gospels that some people would even date to the 3rd century, 2nd century, things like that. And that brings us then to this topic of canonicity. And I think you've talked a little bit about that. So I'm not sure that I need to say much about it. It's a huge topic. And the two big questions are the process, what happened, and the timing, right? Those are the two big questions about it. But even the terminology itself is a little bit difficult, and people will debate the terms. But if we think of the two big questions with canonicity about the process, the first question is, how did these books that we have in our Bible come to be recognized as canonical? What was the process? Were they inspired and accepted from the start? When Paul wrote a letter, did he know that he was writing scripture? Or was that something that only occurred a long time later, after people thought through some process? So what was going on there? And when did it occur? Well, did it happen at the time of writing? Did it happen because of a decision of Constantine, as somebody like Dan Brown one time would have maybe argued for? Not that Dan Brown's a great biblical scholar that we have to pay much attention to, or did it happen a lot later? Well, there's a lot of different answers to that, and I apologize right now for doing this, but I couldn't resist. I'm going to make a small commercial announcement, and that is that I and a guy named Ben Laird have edited a book that's titled 5 Views on the New Testament Canon. It's going to be coming out sometime this year. And if you're interested in some of those questions of canon, you might be interested in picking that book up. It has 5 different views represented in it. It has a traditional evangelical view, basically argues for a self-authenticating scripture, a progressive evangelical view that looks at a church canonical process of formation. It takes a kind of a mainline or secular view, a very naturalistic process. Looks at Roman Catholicism, Council of Trent, and church tradition, and then it has an Orthodox view, not meaning Orthodox as in, correct theology, but the Orthodox Church associated with like the Greek Orthodox. And so it's worth looking into. But what I want to talk about a little bit today is the process by which Paul's letter collection came together and how that relates to the 2nd century. And as we know, Paul died probably around AD 65. And you think, well, how does that have something to do with the 2nd century? Well, I hope to show that the 2nd century is actually pretty important as we think about this. But first, I want to say a couple of things about some 2nd century documents. There are some 2nd century documents that are very, very important in this discussion. And basically because several of them with Paul's life, if you look at Paul's life around 60 to 65 when he was writing and dying, then to the end of the 2nd century with a document we'll talk to about in a minute, P46, Papyrus 46, that forms a window that we can look at to try to examine how Paul's letter collection came about. So the three documents I'm going to talk about are, first of all, this Papyrus P46. Now, this is an interesting document. Papyrus, for those of you who don't know, probably you do know, but I'll just repeat it. It was kind of the paper of the ancient world. It was a plant that was cut, processed, and made into a writing surface. And the papyrus, it looks like this. And this is my display. I have a roll of papyrus here. And this is a fairly typical way it came. You can see it has grain on it, right? You can see the grain. And if you look at that grain, and you see it has horizontal and vertical lines to it, formed into a sheet that you could write on. And these were often used in scrolls. This is a bit of a scroll, right? Rolls up. Or you could cut them and flatten these sheets, use them in flat sheets right on front and back. And those became part of early forms of a codex or a book. And P46 is one of these early books. And in fact, it's the earliest collection of Paul's letters. Now, I have a postcard that I bought at the place, the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, Ireland, where the majority of this P46 is held. And this is what it looks like. You can probably see the writing there on this sheet of papyrus. Do you see that? That's what one of those sheets looks like. It's obviously reduced in size a bit. But you see that beautiful lines with the page number at the top there. That's one of the many sheets of this papyrus. Here's one that's been prepared by them. The engraving here by Albrecht Dürer was not part of the original papyrus, but it shows the letters in a little bit bigger form. You can see there. Beautiful, beautiful artifacts from the ancient world. But P46 is the earliest collection we have in manuscript form of Paul's letters. And it's really quite interesting. There are lots of documents that have been found from the ancient world written on that papyrus. We have wills and receipts and letters and census reports, and all sorts of things. We have literary texts. We have texts of Homer, lots of Homer. He was the favorite author of the ancient world. The Greek tragedians, especially like Euripides. We have Plato, other unknown authors. But we also have biblical texts that we've found from the ancient world. And that's where this P46 came from. There's a lot of debate over the date of this papyrus. Some people think it's surprisingly early. Others think it's in the 3rd century. Most would agree that it dates to around 200. So I use that as sort of the terminal point for our discussion, 200. There's also debate over its contents. And here's what it has of Paul's letters. It starts in the middle of Romans, or Romans 5. It's been broken off at the beginning. And then it goes Romans, Hebrews. You're already thinking, wait a minute, I don't remember Hebrews coming after Romans. I don't even remember that Paul wrote Hebrews necessarily, but here it is. Hebrews, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, and then it begins 1 Thessalonians, and it gets fragmentary and kind of breaks off. So there's 3 key questions. Why is Hebrews there? That's a bit unusual. We're saying this is the first earliest Pauline letter collection. Well, it's an interesting question. Why is it there? Because the book of Hebrews actually is found in lots of different places, depending on which list or early form of the Bible you have. Sometimes it's before the Pauline letters. Sometimes it's after. Sometimes it's between the church letters and the personal letters. But in only one case is it found after Romans, and that's in P46. Most people think it's because Hebrews floated around and somebody just happened to stick it in there. Maybe because there was some thought it was associated with Paul, maybe by Paul, or at least in the Pauline school. The ending of Hebrews sounds a little Pauline. Timothy is mentioned there. Maybe it's somebody says a record of a sermon by Paul to a Hebrew audience. We don't know. What came after? The second question is, what came after 1 Thessalonians? Well, we don't know for sure, but we can reconstruct the book, the codex in which it was written. And we think that probably it had 2 Thessalonians, probably Philemon. but there's a dispute about the pastorals. Well, some claim that it did have the pastorals, but we just have no record of it because the author seems, some people think, to be writing the letters closer together and more lines to a page possibly, so he was going to fit it in even though it didn't seem like there was enough space, or at the end could have added extra sheets to the codex. Others contend that didn't include anything after 2 Thessalonians and Philemon because maybe the pastorals had not been written yet, or were not included for some other reason, or at least written after this collection or manuscript was put together. And then the third question is, why is Ephesians before Galatians? Well, some of you will maybe realize that Ephesians is a longer book than Galatians. And so if you put Ephesians before Galatians, you have actually a canon of Paul's letters in order, descending order, if you put ones that are addressed to the same place together. So if you have Romans, 1 Corinthians, next longest, put 2 Corinthians with it, Ephesians, Galatians, all the way down in descending order. We'll come back to that. That's very important, actually. The second document from the 2nd century, or set of documents, is actually Marcion's canon. Probably you're familiar with Marcion, the heretic from about the middle of the 2nd century. We don't really have any of Marcion's writings. We have records of it and later documents called Marcion's prologues to the Pauline letters. But it's said that he had one gospel, Luke's gospel, and 10 letters of Paul. So the question is, why didn't he have the pastorals in that group? And of course, the question is, maybe the pastorals weren't written. He chose not to because he thought they were personal letters, didn't want to include them, but he would have maybe included Philemon because Philemon is addressed to a number of different people as well as a church in the person's house. So maybe it was considered a church letter. Whatever it is, we're not exactly certain, but this is an item of some discussion because of Marcion forming a canon, even if it's a small canon, right? A canon of books, meaning the Luke's gospel and 10 Pauline letters. Some of you will know that Marcion had this view on the love of God, so he didn't like the idea of the Old Testament God being a God of wrath. He didn't like some of the Jewish elements then of others of the gospel, so he kind of boiled down the New Testament. May have even boiled it down by excluding the pastorals. Irenaeus says that actually Marcion rejected the pastoral epistles and mentions then the other 10 letters in his corpus. The third document I'll mention from the 2nd century is a thing called the Muratorian Fragment or the Muratorian Canon. Now, Muratori was an Italian scholar who found this document that's a Latin copy of a copy of a copy. We don't know, but it supposedly it's a canonical list of books. And it has been a source of controversy recently. Some people think the traditional date is it's in the 2nd century. Others think it dates to the 4th century. But whatever it is, it actually seems to have the Pauline letters in it, all 13 of them, divided into a group of church letters. And you know, when I'm talking about the ecclesial or the church letters, that's from Romans to the end of 2 Thessalonians. And then the personal letters, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Okay? And so that's another document that's important. So what do we do with this? Well, there are 6 major theories on how Paul's letters came together. And I'll talk a little bit briefly about these. They have some overlap with them, but you can see how these documents fit in. So 6 theories on how Paul's letters came together. The first, appropriately enough for where we live, is sometimes called the Snowball Theory. It's called also the gradual collection theory. And there are lots of scholars who are associated with it. Some famous ones like Theodor Zahn and Alfred Harnack, Kirsup Lake, Streeter. And this is the view that it was a sort of a gradual formation. So somebody would say Zahn earlier than Harnack, that sometime around in maybe the 80s, 85, after Paul was dead, they gathered his letters together. Zahn said 10 letters. And then Harnack came along and said, no, somewhere later around AD 100, they gathered these letters together. These are letters that were found in the major cities where Paul had ministered. They would have had the letters there. Paul, was in favor with them, and somebody went and kind of gathered them over time after Paul's death, put them together into a canon of letters. Harnack also noted that there were references to how the letters were written and read in Paul's letters themselves, and make some reference to that. And it seems like somebody then just continued that process of gathering them over time until a canon was formed. Kiersa Blake makes the interesting idea that he thought it took place more as a gradual process that extended into the 2nd century. And so he said that first of all, there were lots of letters to choose from. And so it took a lot of sifting in order to figure out which ones would make it in there. And Streeter actually went so far as to say, yeah, there are 4 stages to it. And it took all the way into around the AD 350. And so his stages would be like the letters like Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, Philippians in the first stage, then forming the 10 letters without the pastorals. That was in the 2nd stage, probably in the 2nd century, a 13-letter corpus with the pastorals around AD 200, and then Hebrews added in around AD 350. So you can see that extends the whole thing pretty far. He wrote before we discovered and published P46, so he didn't know that actually we already knew of Hebrews in the canon before 350. So in this view, the 2nd century is actually very important to the gradual collection theory, because Marcion had a role to play in it. Either the canon was to some extent a response to Marcion. Marcion comes out with his canon, and then the people who had access to Paul's letter said, oh, no. This is what Paul's canon really was. Or maybe the gathering together of these letters first was the thing that caused Marcion to come up with his competing canon. So it was something that was happening possibly with this view in the 2nd century or even later. The second view, that's the gradual or snowball view. The second is the lapsed interest view. In this view, the lapsed interest view is a reaction to that first view. And that says, no, Paul was never that popular after he died. He faded from significance. People forgot about him. And no sign of Paul's letters, for example, in Acts. And so when Acts was written around AD 90, you see that Paul had been out of favor for 25 years or so. But the writing of Acts spurred interest in Paul. And so people decided, hey, this guy's pretty important. He's a center of attention in the book of Acts. We need to gather his letters together. And they thought, well, since Colossae's not mentioned in Acts, they said, maybe Colossians and Philemon was the heart of the collection. But we know that Ephesians seems to reflect Colossae. There seems to be a relationship between the two. And Ephesus was the second most important early Christian city after Syrian Antioch. So maybe that Ephesians was a cover letter for the Pauline canon. And that would account for why in some manuscripts it doesn't have "to the Ephesians" in it. It says it has kind of perhaps it just doesn't mention that. People speculate a space there because it was a circular letter and you put in your own name, right? So that's the letter that's the sort of cover letter for the canon. And when you read it out, you say, to the Christians, where are we? We're in Corinth. To the Christians in Corinth or in Ephesus or something along those lines. Well, there's some problems with that view. First of all, we don't have any evidence that Paul ever passed out of favor. And we have no evidence that Ephesians was ever the cover letter for any group of Paul's letters. It never appears at the beginning or the end of Paul's letters. Even the Muratorian Canon in its ordering has Corinth, the Corinthian letters listed first, not Ephesus. A third view. Third view is sometimes called the Composite Anti-Gnostic theory. Now, this view actually goes back to Bauer, but has been made more popular by a person who kind of follows in Bauer's footsteps, a person by the name of Walter Schmidtals, a German scholar. And again, Schmidt-Als is influenced by Bauer because he's big on the dialectic idea. And rather than emphasizing the dialectic of the Jewish and Hellenistic Christianity, Schmidt-Als emphasizes a dialectic between Christianity and Gnosticism. Now, Bauer had that kind of thing going too. Remember, we talked about that. That was a determining thing for Bauer, why some letters weren't authentic. They reflected Gnostic influence. Schmidt-Als believed that this opposition of Christianity and Gnosticism was very important, but he also believed that many of Paul's letters are composite letters. In other words, the letter we have is made up of lots of smaller letters. So he thought somebody came along and compiled the letters, but also then assembled them. So the Corinthian letters are made of 6 letters. There's 6 Corinthian letters, 4 Thessalonian letters, 3 Philippian letters, 2 Roman letters, and 1 Galatian letter. That's a lot of letters. But somebody came along, put them all together, and formed a 7-letter collection, Schmidt-Als thinks, in the order 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Romans. Okay? And in some ways, and he puts them in that order based on the Muratorian Canon. And he thinks that 1 Corinthians 1:2 is sort of the opening. And then the doxology, the doxology we find at the end of Romans in 16:25 to 27. Schmidt-Als thought it had a kind of Gnostic flavor to it that made us or compelled us to think that the entire collection was a response in some way to Gnosticism. So we had those 7 letters. And then 3 more letters, Colossians, Ephesians, and Philemon were added. But you notice 7 is the first one. You add 3, which is a nice number in itself theologically, but 7 and 3 makes 10, and that's not so good. That seems to violate the rule of 7. And then the pastorals were added, and that makes 13. That's still not good enough. And then Hebrews is added, and now you have 14, and it's 2 times 7. And that's how you can account for all of these being added together. Well, it's an interesting idea, and nobody really believes it much, I don't think. But you can see how theology perhaps has an influence on people thinking about the formation of the Pauline letter collection. It also requires a very early view of Gnosticism to have had an earlier emphasis as fundamental in Christianity. And nobody really believes in the composite nature of all these letters. Some occasionally come up with composite views, for example, for Philippians, but it's not a very widespread view. And in fact, Schmidt-Als ignores the 2nd century evidence, even though he's kind of placing stuff in the 2nd century with all these sort of later pseudepigraphal works, because the Muratorian Canon does have the order that he has for those 7 letters, but it also includes the pastorals, because it includes, in fact, all 13 letters. The next view, the 4th view, is called the personal involvement theory. Personal involvement theory. There are several various views of this theory, but basically they're all arguing that individuals were involved in forming the Pauline canon, and in some cases, a group of individuals, what some people might call a Pauline school. And one scholar named Charlie Moll, thought that Luke was the person who was this individual who formed Paul's canon. Luke was the author of Acts. He gathered the Pauline letters together after he composed the book of Acts, and after Paul had died, went around to the various cities, gathered up the letters. It was a 10-letter collection. And then Moll thought that the pastorals sound a lot like Luke in some way. So he thought Luke maybe had a hand in or composed the pastoral epistles. That's how you come up with your 13. Another scholar named Guthrie thought Timothy was the person who had the role to play in gathering the letters. And Timothy, we know, is listed as sort of a co-author of letters with Paul in many cases. Guthrie says there's never a time when Paul's letters were neglected. They were widely read. We know that by the time of Clement, they were well known. So Timothy collected them together after the composition of Acts. And some of the letters just simply weren't put in because they were not thought to be important or whatever reason, like letter to the Laodiceans or something like that. Others have argued there was a Pauline school, meaning not followers like disciples of Paul, but they were people who were involved with Paul in his ministry, companions, and they took on the responsibility after his death of gathering the letters together. But they also, according to this view, Harry Gamble argues for this, they also composed some of the letters, some of the Deutero-Pauline letters, out of respect or whatever for Paul. Well, what's the relationship of the second century to this view? Well, if you have the the Timothy and the Luke view, probably not that much of the second century, except that was a time of dissemination for Paul's letters. But for the community view, that would be an important time period when the pseudepigraphal letters probably were written. Although it's probably hard to see how a group of people that really, really respected Paul would claim to be Paul when they were not Paul and put his name on the letters, since in the ancient world, anytime pseudepigraphal writings were discovered, it was basically they were excluded and there was rebuke connected with them. The fifth view is the Pauline involvement view. Pauline involvement view. And this has been argued by David Trobisch especially. Basically, Trobisch argues that Paul himself was a major instigator of his own letter collection, or at least the first four letters. First four letters, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians. We're back to Bauer's hypothesis of the four authentic letters. And Trobisch focuses upon arrangement of the Pauline letters and notes that in the early collections, like the manuscripts of Sinaiticus and others, they have the same canonical order. But P46 doesn't follow that order. We already noticed that. And so he noticed that as well. And so he uses this as a way of saying that we see in these collections of Paul's letters, not for P46, the reflection of the three-stage process to gathering Paul's letters. So Romans to Galatians, the first group, were gathered by Paul, right? And they were formed a unit. They were gathered by Paul himself. And we see that they are four letters in descending order of length. He gathered those together, and Romans 16, that some people think was not part of the original of Romans, that became sort of the cover letter for this collection of Paul's authentic letters. Then there was a stage 2, then it was an expansion of the Pauline corpus to 13 letters, and it starts over in length then, because Ephesians is longer, and then it goes descending order, and then the church letters. And then stage 3, they became the sort of fixed form of the codexes like the Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, the big early Bibles of the 4th century that were really the important collections of writings. So this view of Trobisch has some very interesting elements to it. Paul himself involved in it, and he uses the idea of descending order to show how they were arranged. And so it's descending order for the first 4, then starts over again for the additions, and then starts over with the church letters that are again argued for in descending order. Depends heavily on the 2nd century, especially for that second phase where the Ephesians takes over and you have that second period in the formation of Paul's canon. But it's also a return to Bauer's view of 4 authentic letters and all the rest of them being pseudepigraphal. Well, we come to the 6th and final view, and this is the view that I promote. And in fact, I think it's the view that I pretty much developed. I don't know, some others may have, but I've spent a lot of time trying to develop this view myself. And I'll call it the Pauline or personal involvement theory in the 13 letter collection. So basically, it's an extension in some ways of Trobisch, but I think it's also a correction to Trobisch based on some of the evidence we have. Basically, I think Paul was responsible for the entire 13 letters. So if we can agree that personal involvement is something we can assume, and I think most of the views are based on some kind of personal involvement, whether it's whoever it was or a small group, a personal involvement. You don't need fragmentary views at all. There was probably a single gathering place to gather them all together. And I think everyone thinks, and I think that P46 is very important. Now, Trobisch says himself about P46 that he never knows of any collection of the Paul's letters ever circulating that didn't have all 13 letters to them, which makes an interesting comment on P46, doesn't it? By implication, he's saying P46 would have had all 13 letters. And I think there's some evidence of that. If we look in First Clement, I think you can make an argument that's either quotation or allusion to most of Paul's letters, including Romans, 1 Corinthians, Titus, 1 Timothy, as well as Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. In other words, pretty much all of the disputed letters, I think you can find evidence for by the end of the first century in Clement's letter. So what do we do with this evidence? Well, we know there was a collection then of Paul's letters by the end of the second century. We know from P46. I think we can get earlier than that if we look at Clement and see that there were 13 letters. One person could have gathered all the letters together. Keep in mind, the extent of Paul's ministry was from Galatia in the east to Rome in the west, and that's only 1,100 miles. Most of his letters were written to places within 150 miles of the Aegean Sea. However, Paul was an ancient letter writer. One of the things neglected to talk about is that well-known ancient letter writers, those of the Greco-Roman period, typically made copies of their own letters. And we know this from some of the ancient papyri where we have copies of the letters kept, or we have references to copies made. And in fact, the best known person we have of this is Paul's rough contemporary, the Latin writer Cicero, who talks often about not only his scribe, Tiro, but of collecting letters together, making copies of letters, keeping all of the records of his letters. And so I want to argue that, in fact, P46 gives us insight here. Trobisch says that Paul was responsible for the first 4 letters, but I think you can argue on the same lines that Paul was responsible for all the letters. And P46 gives us this insight. We don't have to pay attention to where Hebrews is. Let's say Hebrews comes from somewhere else or was floating around. We don't have to talk about Hebrews at this point. But you notice that P46 puts Ephesians before Galatians. And that follows, in fact, the order according to length. And that is gathered before the major codices that have Galatians, Ephesians. You have Ephesians, then Galatians. We also have some other variations in the Pauline canon, but not very many. The corpus is relatively stable, but if we're willing to see P46 giving this insight, what do we have now? We now have, in fact, the very pattern that Trobisch says shows you that Paul was involved in his gathering together consistently for all of the church letters in descending order. Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians put with it, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, and then 2nd. And then you restart with the church letters, with the personal letters, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon. So that reflects the order as far as the Pauline letters goes of P46, preserves the fact that it looks like we have evidence of all 13 letters by the end of the first century. And it gives an indication that if Trobisch is right, Paul was involved in those first 4 letters. There's no reason why Paul could not have been involved in all 13 of the letters. So what probably happened was that Paul composed his letters in various places and sent them out to these destinations. But he, or members of his team, his group, his disciples, kept copies as they traveled. And so collecting the letters was not an afterthought or something that occurred after Paul died, but it was something done along the way throughout Paul's ministry. They were kept by Paul and his team. And so, in fact, when Paul died, they already had the Pauline letter collection. And maybe during travels, some may have been lost or some may have been thought not to be as important, but the ones that they had were the basis of the Pauline letter collection that we have. How does that relate to the second century? Well, how that relates to the second century is that, in fact, the Pauline letter collection was made far in advance of the second century. That would mean that Marcion's canon was not the first canon of Paul's letters or first canon period. It was a reaction probably to Paul's already existent letter collection. And the Muratorian Canon, with its division between church letters and personal letters, is a reflection of that early way that the Pauline letter collection was gathered together, just as P46 seems to indicate. So conclusion, and then we can open up to questions. 4 brief conclusions, bringing us back to the 2nd century. First of all, Marcion's canon. Whether it was a response or an instigator has been the debate. I think Marcion's canon was a response. It was a response to what was already going on, and especially the formation already of Paul's letter collection gathered by himself. The Muratorian Canon, it attests to all 13 of the Pauline letters with the organization by 2 major categories. We may not understand why the church letters are organized as they are, starting with Corinth and then ending in Rome, but they have the church letters and then they have the personal letters, just as we saw in the canon that we talked about. And P46 is important, not so much for Hebrews, although it'd be interesting to talk about that, but more for the fact that it puts Ephesians before Galatians. So when all is said and done, someone or some people had to collect together Paul's letters into the Pauline letter collection. And it appears to me, as likely as not, that Paul himself was the person who instigated and did and completed that process. Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it.